Welcome to The Revolution Will Be Messy, a podcast to address the messiness of the moment with your hosts Renee Lemus and Cynthia Silverstein. Come along as they sift through the murky waters of current political topics on their journey toward collective liberation.
Hi, welcome back to
Hello.
our.
Every episode starts with nervous laughter.
You know what? I think that's important to name that when we're laughing, we are not diminishing anything. It is nervous laughter. I have to say that often because I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not
And sometimes,
laughing at anybody's pain. I just don't know what else to do.
no. Usually when like I laugh in those situations, I'm like, I am laughing at myself for having such a hard time communicating because I should be able, I have this assumption of myself that I should be able to talk through really, really hard things. And then when I'm like, oh, I have no words, then I just laugh because what are you going to do?
Yeah. I similarly, or I'll laugh at like, I think how ridiculous it is to have to kind of name all these things or to be like, oh, this is what we're doing. Okay, yeah, like, well, that being said,
Let's get into it.
let's get into it. I think we've been wanting to, I honestly think like one of our first kind of DM conversations was about this. I think because I witnessing what was happening on social media, and there was I heard a call for like, I just heard anti-Semitism being thrown around, and I thought I had an understanding of anti-Semitism. And then I just saw a lot of like murkiness around that. Some people saying this is what it is, some people saying no, this is not what it is. And I was like, whoa, if there's this debate around what it is, then what is it? And I think at the time, my attempt to like talk about it in my classes, I was like, oh shit, did I inadvertently like say this? And I remember
dip a toe in anti-Semitism.
Yes! And I like DM'd you. I was like, hey, so this is what I said. And I felt like you were very good at being like, well, as long as you're not blaming all Jews for A, B, and C, And I was like, oh, okay. Like that made it really clear to me what it is and what it isn't, even though I think there's still nuances and murkiness and all that. Like, it helped me to kind of check myself. And then I think it also helped me to like, when I saw things being posted, to be like,
yeah.
Okay, what's going on here? And I think even people throwing out terms like blood libel, and I was like, what the fuck is blood libel? Like I literally had to go look it up. And then once I looked it up, I was like, oh, so this, then it really kind of started to create a bigger picture of what was happening.
Yeah, I definitely think that early on, I kept seeing anti-Semitism is so interesting because I kept seeing it from both sides. Both Jews and non-Jews inadvertently doing things that were anti-Semitic and finding it really difficult to go, oh, wait, okay, stuff is happening, but are we looking at the way things are being perpetuated? And then also kind of realizing, oh, a lot of non-Jews do not know what, and like, we think we know. We do our Holocaust Museum unit in like, what is elementary school? All of these things, right? Like we read the Diary of Anne Frank, although I don't know if people are still reading it.
I know it at my kids' school, the 8th graders read it.
Okay, I couldn't remember if it was like middle school.
I want to say 7th, 8th grade,
7th, 8th grade? Yeah, that sounds about right. But we are given this knowledge. We are taught the word anti-Semitism, but it's never really broken down. And so as people were posting things, I was like, oh no. I agree with everything you said until you got to this very anti-Semitic sentence at the end of your post. But, you know, like realizing I don't think they're aware.
Yeah.
I don't think that they're fully like versed in
Yeah.
the depth of anti-Semitism to know
Yeah.
that you can very easily do that. It's very much
Yeah.
like anti-Blackness and racism. You can very easily, without
Mhm.
even thinking, just veer a little bit into
Or
that
if you
lane.
don't know it, or if you don't realize it, because anti-black, or right, anti-blackness is such a part of our socialization, like normal socialization, right? Like it's just a part. Anti-black statements are such a part of our lexicon that we don't even think about it. And I think similarly, I remember you posting something about latent anti-Semitism, and I was like, fuck, like, and so to me, I heard that as, oh, that's like systemic institutionalized racism, right? Like it is such a part of the foundation of our society that we can't even see it when it's in our face. And
100%.
so just like we call for people to really unpack and unlearn, anti-blackness, all of these things, like it has to be a concerted effort, right? Like, I mean, I've been saying this all, like it has to be a concerted effort because all of these things are so normalized. I'm like, oh, that makes sense, right? Like there has to be a concerted effort to really see the ways in which anti-Semitism is foundational. And so I think that was such an important thing for me to really think about, like, oh, how are these parts of anti-Semitism so foundational to the way we understand the world that we're not seeing them when they show up. So I want to say that because I think that's what we're going to be unpacking. I also want to say that something I remember you had texted me, when we're especially getting into conversations around Islamophobia on the other hand, right? And I remember you saying something like, is like, I don't want to center, I forgot where there was sort of fear around like, should we talk about anti-Semitism when we're trying to center, Palestinians and trying to center this cause? And I was like, yes, but we also should be talking like, because if we're
Yes,
saying,
I was the one that was like, I don't want to talk about
yeah,
anti-Semitism
yeah,
because people will be anti-Semitic towards me if I talk about anti-Semitism.
yeah, I think there was fear around like this idea of like, wanting to center what's happening in Palestine and Gaza and all those things. But I think if we are going to talk about collective liberation, then we need to talk about those things, right? And we need to sort of see the ways in which anti-Semitism is connected to Islamophobia and connected
Yeah.
to anti-blackness and connected to white supremacy overall, like all of these things. And because we're dealing with these very specific things, we have to because I think for me, I'm like, okay, so there's people who are there's like different groups of people, right? There's people who are gonna be anti-Semitic, anti-black, and not give a shit, right? Like we know
Yeah.
those people out there, right? And
Those
then they're
people will
gonna sort of
exist.
take advantage of different moments, right? And be like, oh, let's go in, whatever. And then I think there's people who I don't know what we want to call, but just very much like
Casual anti-Semites.
yeah. Well, like, I think for me, I'm like, my biggest concern is if people in activist circles, social justice circles, DEI circles are getting called out for their anti-Semitism, and the immediate defense is like, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I'm like, yes, maybe, but that doesn't mean anti-Semitism isn't happening at all. And I think
Correct.
that's where I get a little like, ooh, it seems like the conversation around anti-Semitism is being shut down altogether. And I feel like if we are going to really have a true, movement that is really centered on collective liberation, then we do need to get into the weeds of it so that we're not perpetuating it, yeah.
Absolutely. I think 100%. I think that if we're people that are standing strong on this collective liberation, we can't then go, but in this instance, we're going to do the same exact things that we're trying to stand up against. which I think people don't know that they're doing, because anti-Semitism is caught up in so much around whiteness and privilege and what those words mean, that it's hard to say, okay, well, this is the same as hatred being directed at people who don't fall into the construct of whiteness, that don't have privilege. And then things get super messy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I think this is where we get like so nervous to kind of unpack these things, you know. I mean, even like over the course of the last few days, we were like texting back and forth, like, oh, that means we have to dive into like the race as a social construct, and we have to dive into like what is colonization, and like it really opens up Pandora's box in terms of having to like talk about these larger concepts. But I think like that's okay. Like we should be able to do
We
that.
should be able to. And I think what I have also come to, like, in texting you this weekend and in like sort of reviewing notes, is we have to open up our views a little bit. Like we have to like widen our lens slightly and go, oh, this singular thing is actually 20 other things combined into one.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, all of those 20 things are incredibly difficult to talk about.
Yeah.
And very uncomfortable. But unless we get down to that, like the ironies contained within this topic, we're not going to get to a wider answer.
Yeah.
Because things are not clear cut. Things aren't clear. And I think I've said this in the beginning, like we are constantly looking for a way to make it binary. Like anti-Semitism is this, anti-Semitism is not this. But unfortunately, the information flows in like both directions at the same time. And one of the things that like I felt early on is other Jews unwittingly being racist against Jews of color, which also would be anti-Semitism, because they're defining Jewishness as one particular thing and sort of kind of following along on a myth of, well, Jewishness is this, which is actually the same sort of mentality that brings all of these like conspiracy theories and things about Jews, because then you're like saying, well, Jewishness can just be this one thing. So I always kind of felt like in the middle in this like very uncomfortable space of like, well, if you are saying that I'm not a Jew and you yourself are Jewish, aren't you then sort of practicing the same thing?
So this, I mean, I have seen this, very pro-Zionist, I would say, propaganda, right? Kind of really trying or attempting to kind of say like, not all Jews are white, which I'm like, yeah, not all Jews are white, but do you? Like, I like, it's just kind of because it just, I mean, so I think this brings us to the article that we want to kind of talk about, right? Which is,
I was going to say, Dara Horn is a perfect example of this. In her article for The Atlantic, why the most educated people in America fall for anti-Semitic lies. Oh yeah, there you go. I didn't print out the picture.
Oh yeah.
Yours is better.
I remember I saw it going around and I was like, shit. Because I think some of the big, like on social media, some of the like takeaways were like, this is why DEI efforts are shit. Like it was kind of shitting on DEI. And I was like, oh no, like we're making these blanket statements about DEI. And then I kind of started going around and I was like, maybe I don't have to deal with it. And then I think you like sent it to me. I was like, oh shit. If she's reading it and seeing stuff, I gotta read it. And then I did a deep dive and I was like, first of all, this is a long ass fucking article.
So long. It took me a really, like, when I sent it to you, I was like, I'm done reading it. This is the
I
paragraph
know
where
you
I'm
were so
stopping.
pissed the whole time.
I
You're
was
like, I
like, I'm
can't do
so
it.
angry.
And I was reading and I was like, oh my God, what is happening? And I think, we were talking just before we hit record that I feel like this is very much a representation of like what's happening in the larger sort of
Yeah.
conversation around anti-Semitism, in that there's a lot of things that are true and real in here, right? Like the way that she sort of begins to frame anti-Semitism, a lot of the ways in which she's calling out very real experiences of Jewish students in universities, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of things, even, we even said there's a lot of very good, not good, what's the word? There's fair critiques of DEI efforts, right? Like
Yeah,
there's fair critiques
absolutely.
of, and then right, it's like, okay, I'm with you. And then there's this turn, and I'm like, what? Like, how did we go from like, here's what anti-Semitism, here's these historical things, like you said, here's this evidence, but it's DEI efforts are to blame, or like it goes into this other thing, and I'm like, ooh, here's where we get messy.
It gets really messy, and like, to the point about Jews of color, she throws that in to prove her point, which is the thing that I have the biggest, like, the hard time. She's like, also, by the way, when she's talking about the DEI efforts in particular, also, by the way, there are Jews of color. And we're like, yeah, but you're not really, if you are concerned about that, devote a whole paragraph to it, maybe, or discuss how that works in Jewish spaces, because unfortunately, at the very least, there should be an admittance to, and I don't think this is controversial to say, that the Jewish narrative in the United States is very Ashkenormative. Ashkenazi Jews are the centralized Jewish story. You see, we got movies, we got stories. That's the story that the general public sees the most. They see Eastern European Jews. They see New York Jews that are descendant of Eastern European Jews. The stories are very centered.
So very, very white centered within the Jewish narrative, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say
I
so.
mean,
I don't think that's controversial. I think we can accept that
we
there
say
are.
that, and there might be controversy.
No.
But
Someone's not going to accept it. I know.
But I want to say this because I feel like maybe this can help people. I don't know, but I feel like it's helped me. But I've also, have come to accept a lot of things. But like, I feel like for me, I've been able to relate that to like Latino culture, or Mexican culture, where in that within Latino culture at large, that we have a very similar conversation around like race and ethnicity and blah 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 blah. And when we see Latino stories in mainstream media, it is very white centered, right? It is very much centered on or at best the mestizo, right? Like the light, even in novelas, right? You're often seeing, very light complexion.
Very.
And so, and I don't think that's controversial to say either, right? Like, because two things can be true at the same time, right? Where you can say, okay, Latinos are discriminated against within sort of the American national imaginary, but at the same time, there is colorism and there is things within our community that we need to sort of work through, right? Just because we're all discriminated against doesn't mean we're all discriminated against equally, right? Like, it becomes like this larger complex conversation. And so for me, that makes sense because I've already kind of grappled with that within my own community. And so I'm like, oh, it seems like that's similarly happening within Jewish communities. But I'm wondering, and I'm like gonna ask you this, like, do you feel like there is almost this like, I want to say like weaponizing, where it's like within Jewish communities, it's like they haven't really acknowledged their own internal racism, but then will kind of tokenize the Jews of color to weaponize it against critiques of that.
Yes. Yes.
Like, did I say that correctly?
Yes. Listen, it's very interesting to me that before October 7th, my husband was going around to various synagogues, hired by those synagogues, specifically because they recognized that there was biases, that at certain places, at shul, at synagogue, in different Jewish circles, the narrative does not always easily include Jews of color. So there is a recognition. Otherwise, he wouldn't have a job, right? He wouldn't be traveling to these places and having people go, hey, tell us, we really are interested. I mean, he was doing DEI work in DEI workshops to say, hey, what are the internal biases that we hold that make it difficult to see a brown person as a Jew? Yeah. What is it that's difficult to say, oh, wow, you know, here's a Black Jew, his story must be the same as me. From my personal experience, and this has changed now, but 20 years ago, walking into synagogue, people would go, hi, can I help you? Instead of, you know, like kind of assuming that I'm not meant to be there. And then you get the questions of, so how are you Jewish? So what is your mom Jewish? Are your, like, how are you existing in this space as a Jew? Yeah. Which is rooted in a lot of biases. Because if I were white and walked into that space, or white presenting, that wouldn't happen, right? Yeah. It would just be taken at face value that I was meant to be there. Yeah. So there is a recognition. I've seen the tokenization happening a lot after 2020, where now it's like, oh, look, there are Jews of color. Do you see? And we're going to have like all of these events. And now we're going to fund Jews of color initiatives, which I feel are very important. But in my family, at least, we're kind of, and maybe because we do the work outside of Jewish communities as well, that it now feels like, well, why can't I just be a Jew? Why do I have to have a monthly circle just for Jews of color? Why do I have to go to a Jews of color Hanukkah party? Why can't I just be Jewish? Yeah. Obviously, the reason why those places exist is because we're not seen. And so we have to create these places where we feel safe. But at the same time, then, are we doing the work in the Jewish community as a whole to make folks feel included and part of the tribe? Yeah. Or are we kind of reinforcing these systems of like, well, Jews of color are over there, and we'll pull them out when we're talking about not being included in DEI spaces, but you know, the rest of the year they can kind of stay over there and do their own thing.
That's real.
I don't know that a lot of people agree with me. I think people really want and need those spaces to be seen because it has been hard. Yeah. But I'm waiting for the day where I can just say, oh, I'm Jewish. Yeah. And I'd be like, I'm a Mexican Jew, or my husband's a Black Jew. Like,
and have to like give your whole background, right?
Give my whole background, be like, okay, this is why. This is why.
Yeah. This is how this happened. What I think is interesting that what you said though in the beginning there was like for there to be this normativity around like the Ashkenazi narrative is inherently like anti-Semitic, right? Because by essentially marginalizing, right, like Jews of color, then that perpetuates anti-Semitism in and of itself. And I think that that's such a fascinating, you know, thing to talk about. And I think too, like I said, I think for me, I'm like, what's been the most disappointing, I think, is that within circles where we have that language, where we know, like, okay, we know what systemic racism looks like, when we know what marginalization, all that looks like, why is it so difficult for us to name and see anti-Semitism, right? If we know what systemic, like, discrimination or whatever you want to call it looks like, then why can't we see that? And I want to say, which interestingly enough, because I think she's pointing out some things again that are like true, but then the conclusions get, I think, real like effed up. But like, I remember, I have a PhD in ethnic studies. And so when we were, and there was this real kind of push to sort of to come away from like identity politics. So to come away from like Chicano studies versus Asian American studies versus, blah, blah, blah. And I remember being like, wait, but like, we have to understand the like specificities of all these things. But I think the attempt was to say, like, there's these larger frameworks that impact us all. They may impact us in these very, specific ways, but things like colonialism and white supremacy, all of these things are these larger things that impact us all. But I do remember the very few times where like Jewishness was brought up, it was very much like how the Jews became white, right? Yeah. And so I think there's this sort of narrative that all Jews within an American context
are white.
Like they were able to kind of subsume themselves within like whiteness. And so I think even having that narrative in my mind kind of was like, oh, well, yeah, then, because I was like, ooh, she's making some fair critiques, because this was the framework that I, was kind of taught within ethnic studies circles. And not to say that was the like overarching message, but without getting into the nuances of that. And for somebody who isn't familiar with the histories of those things, that's all I was left with was Jews became white. And that was kind of it.
And some Jews did become white. Some Jews were able to get benefit from the construct of whiteness.
Yes.
Right? And that's always like, that's the thing that I think always gets really messy for me, is that I go, you say whiteness and people think, oh, blonde, blue-eyed. But there is the construct of whiteness, which is, can I have privilege? Can I have a certain advantage or access just based on where I am, who I am? And it is like phenotypically, obviously, like the leg up. But I would even say that some Persian Jews also fall into that construct of whiteness because of their privilege. They're not white per se,
but
they are
Persian. I think whiteness in that, in terms of construct, is more is phenotype, and right, there's you can perform whiteness in so many ways, right? You can act white, you can talk white, right? Like there's a lot of ways in which whiteness is a performance, and that the closer you can get, the closer in proximity you are into whiteness, whether it be phenotype or these other performance ways, the more privileges you're going to have. I mean, that's the way white supremacy works. Like that's the way it's meant to work, right? It's meant to sort of erase anything that is not white, even in bodies, of people of color, right? Like that's, I mean, I talk about assimilation and like all of these things, right? Like white supremacy works on this like larger scale, which I think we want to hold for another episode.
Okay, fine. We will hold the white supremacy for another.
Yeah. But I think like coming back to the conversation around like anti-Semitism, I think, this Atlantic article, on one hand, again, I was like, there's real experience, like Jewish students are having real life experiences, right?
Right. Like, nobody should be knocking on windows of like Jewish students just gathering. that to me was like, yes, that is major anti-Semitism, because the assumption that these Jews, or even like wearing your kippah, your yarmulke, if you're an observant Jew, and getting shouted at, that's a huge assumption on the part of the person shouting at you, that you believe something just because you are presenting as a Jew, right? Like, I know a lot of people who wear their kippah every single day that also shout Free Palestine, that are for it. And for you to be a non-Jew and go, oh, kippah means you're a Jew who is against Palestine, is completely anti-Semitic. So these kids should be able to not have to deal with that.
And I think it's, again, this is where I think it gets messy, because I feel like there's this argument that on the other hand, because those things are happening, those very real things are happening that we need to discuss, that we need to call out. But I think on the other hand, there's this idea that because that's happening, that anybody who says Free Palestine is also inherently anti-Semitic.
Right.
And so I feel like, and this is, I mean, I was like, oh, we gotta do an episode on doppelganger, right? On
Yes.
because I think this is where the mirror, right? Like both, like, so you're assuming that anybody who's Jewish is genocidal Zionist maniac, right?
Yes.
Like, and you're assuming that anybody who says Free Palestine is anti-Semitic and is calling for a Jewish genocide, right? Like, and I'm like, hello, are we not seeing how we're just mirroring the same thing? And where do we go from there, right? Like, if
we're basically tying each other's hands behind our backs and going like that's it. That this is, if you shout Free Palestine, you want me dead. And if I wear a kippah, I want you dead. Which is like, okay.
Yeah. And I think that's what is so that's what's so frustrating, right? Because like, how are we going to get anywhere? How are we get what is the, like, it feels like
there is no conversation at that point. There is no conversation.
It silences everything, right? It just like, it silences everything. And so I think we struggle in like, how do we have that conversation about anti-Semitism without, I mean, and so I think, we can kind of get into some of these things of the article, right? I think, and even your notes, right, where you talk about, okay, what is let's talk about that. Like, what is anti-Semitism? Like, what does that mean? What does it look like to be anti-Semitic? And caveat to listeners, we are not saying this is the end all be all definitions of anti-Semitism. No. We are just working through some things here.
We are working through some things. And this is like, when I was reading her article, I was like, yes, this is 100% conspiracy theories that Jews own the banks, that Jews are responsible for like the majority of Hollywood or whatever that one is, like that they run the media, right? Absolutely anti-Semitic. Any conspiracy theory is going to be problematic. Holocaust denial. Being able to stand and say the Holocaust didn't happen, anti-Semitic. The blood libel, which is one that she brings up, and even her ties to this notion that Israel, she brought up blood libel, which is that Jews would eat babies.
So I mean, what is blood libel? Like I said, I had to look that one up, and I was like, the images that came up from like, like medieval era was very strange. I was like, wait, what? This is what blood libel is?
Well, it's that they would kill babies, right? Like, I don't know, you might not be more familiar with it since you read it. I haven't looked up blood libel in a very long time.
It was something about like ritualistically killing babies kind of thing.
Like they would steal your baby and eat them, right? Completely anti-Semitic. Started probably as a way to demonize Jews, which anytime you're demonizing somebody, it's going to be racism or anti-Semitism.
Dehumanization.
dehumanization, right?
Yeah.
But then she started getting those. I was like, yes, 100% with you, absolutely anti-Semitic, humanization of Jews. And then she started going into the fact that people are saying Jews are settler colonialists is anti-Semitic.
That's
Or
a big one.
the Jewish civilization isn't indigenous to Israel. Now, I have seen social media as a problem, but I have seen a lot of posts that go, I just saw one today, like, look at the people, look at how people treat the trees or the plants or whatever. Have you
The
seen that
land.
one? The land. And that's how you know that they're indigenous, which
Mhm.
is a very beautiful notion, but also very cut and dry. And
Mhm.
nothing in this is cut and dry.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've run up against is a lot of like with other Jews in these conversations is this one. This is a really big one. That it is anti-Semitic to say that Jews are not indigenous to Israel because that is denying their existence, which is anti-Semitic. But it's not that clear cut. And then she kind of sums it all up and goes, the biggest thing is that, and I don't know where she got this, and tell me if you had the same impression, but she was like, the biggest problem is that people think that anti-Semitism is righteous now, that it's good to be an anti-Semite because being anti-Semitic is now seen as a resistance to evil because Jews are collectively evil and therefore have no right to exist. And I was like, where did you, how?
Yes.
How did you
So I
come to
think
this?
she was saying that, and I've seen this argument like several times, this idea that, I mean, she said something about the USSR basically exported their anti-Semitism to social justice circles. Like, is that what I I was
Yes,
like,
which is
oh,
crazy
she
because
said,
she was like, yeah,
she
go ahead,
says
read it. You're
the
there.
USSR exported this messaging. She was talking about like Zionism versus anti-Zionism, and that, you know, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, right? And she says, so the USSR exported this messaging to its client states in the developing world and ultimately to social justice minded circles in the United States. And I was like, what? When? How? What? How? What? Like, that was so confusing to me.
It was so confusing to me too because I was like, she said something about Jews and like communism, and I'm like, do you know how many Jews are communists? And yes, Russia was like anti-Jews, right?
Yeah.
I think still is not a great place.
Right.
But she did this twist all of a sudden, and I was like, oh, I guess that's her link to say that now by default social justice circles are anti-Semitic. But I could not follow. I could not be like, I couldn't see the causation.
Yeah. I think you're right. Like, she says sort of like, oh yeah, anti-Semitism is equated with resistance, is equated with, you know, justice, like all of these things. And I understand how, I mean, I guess on one hand, I can say I understand how you can maybe make that conclusion, given that in these pro-Palestinian marches is where you're seeing some of this anti-Semitism happening. But I'm also inclined to be like, are you actually in activist circles? Do you actually go to organizing meetings? Are you actually in these spaces? And
That's exactly what Joshua said because I was reading this and I was like, oh my God. He's like, what are you doing? And I told him, and he's like, has this woman been to a DEI space? Has she taken a DEI like course?
class,
How does
yeah,
she know? And I was like, no, she has. Wait. And I was like, no, wait, she hasn't. She's
yeah,
talked to people who are telling her these things.
yeah.
And this we can come back to later, but I think if she were to attend, she might have a better idea. Where was I going with that? Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know that she has been in these places.
Yeah, I mean, even speaking to the idea of like colonialism, there was two things that I was like, she says, the modern political idea, because she's getting into Zionism, right? And again, like what is Zionism versus anti-Zionism and how that's, conflated with anti-Semitism, blah, blah, blah. So she says the modern political idea of Zionism as Jewish self-determination in this homeland emerged in the late 19th and 20th centuries amid many other anti-colonial movements around the world as global power dynamics shifted from empires toward nation states. And I was like, huh. Because what she's saying, tell me if I'm wrong, what she's trying to argue is that Zionism is an anti-colonial movement. But then she says, power dynamics shifted from empires to nation states. So on one hand, because I did say like, well, is she arguing that Zionism was then or are we arguing? Anyway, but she goes on to say, the large and often violent population upheavals following Israel's creation. So I was like, oh, so she's admitting there's violent upheavals, right? Including the displacement of most Arabs from what became Israel and the displacement of nearly all Jews from what became Arab states, paralleled similar population upheavals around the world as new states emerged from receding empires. In this, Zionism was typical. And I was like, typical to what? Colonialism? Right?
That part, I had to reread. I'm trying to find it again here. I read it as Zionism is so tricky because I think folks today believe in this beautiful notion and idea of a return to home, which is what anybody living in a diaspora wants, right? You want a home. You don't feel, as much as you can like try to embrace the nationalism of whatever country you are living in, it doesn't feel like home.
Yeah.
So I could see where she was trying to go, but to me it felt like she was comparing it to other revolutions that like broke off from colonialism to create a home for their native people. And I just can't agree with that.
This is what I'm saying. So in the same sentence, right? On one hand, she's like you said, I think comparing Zionism to these like revolutionary movements, right? Like, we've talked about the Haitian Revolution, right? Like these kinds of things. She calls it anti-colonial, but then very clearly says one towards nation states. And so I think I'm like, nation states are colonial empires. So you're not really shifting from empire to nation states, you're shifting empire to empire. Like that's all that's fucking happening here, right? Like, and I think that's where people get, because I think there's this narrative even within the United States history, right? Like, oh, the United States was founded by people who were escaping religious persecution in Europe, and they came and created this country that was freedom and liberty for all, right? And we're like, no, all it did was leave England to come and build another fucking empire. Like that's all that really happened, right? Like US nationalism is bullshit. let's just call it what it is. So I think this is this argument that I keep seeing, right? Is like, oh, Zionism is essentially, I mean, I don't want to say that, but like I'm interpreting this like Zionism is like Jewish nationalism.
That's what people believe. That
But
is what
as
people
if
think.
that's again, but then she's excusing like all this violent upheaval and saying, well, that's what happens when you shift from, empire to nation states. And so why should it be any different with Israel? And I'm
But she's
like,
kind of using the same argument that that these militias like all over the world when they want to overthrow their governments, she's basically saying, but that's okay. That's
But
okay. You're supposed to do that. And then
that's
going,
what
but
we said
not
all along, right? Like, so then what's the difference there?
Palestinians though. Not
Right.
Palestinians though.
I'm like, this is why I think, again, the whole doppelganger thing rings so true, because again, she says Zionism was typical. And I'm like, yeah, typical to colonialism, but then you want to say it's anti-colonial. No, colonialism is that very notion that we achieve safety, we achieve all of these things through violent upheaval.
Yeah.
Like,
the thing
no.
to me too, no. The thing to me too is that, and this is what like I was saying from the very beginning, when it came to this argument of settler colonialism, because then she goes and talks about how anti-Semitic it is to have a class at Harvard that's like the effects of settler colonialism on like health determination or like health outcomes. And she's like, that's anti-Semitic, because the class was about the United States, Australia, and, or South Africa. It was about the United States, South Africa, and Israel. And it's anti-Semitic to include Israel in that, because the title of the course was The Settler Colonial Determinants of Health. What people, and this is where I don't hear this name enough, but Arthur Ruppin was essentially known, or is known, I guess now by historians, as the father of anti-Semitism. Oh my God. The father of Zionism.
Okay.
So he was
Freudian
a man of his time.
But...
yeah, Freudian flip, but maybe because he did some interesting things. He was kind of like among the first people tasked with going to what he called Palestine, creating a company essentially to buy land from people that live there, with the sole purpose of getting them out, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was a German who was an intellectual, a scientist that believed in social Darwinism, that believed in the notions of biological determinism, and was like very wrapped up in the like anthropology, social sciences of the time, which were racist and based on traits and eugenics, essentially, right?
Yeah.
What I always tell folks is, while it is true that Jewish culture has existed in Palestine, in the Middle East, for centuries, the people who spawned this idea of Zionism to create a nation brought with them the ideas that built colonialism and empires. They brought these Eastern European ideals with them, which inevitably is colonization. They did not come with the beliefs from centuries ago.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't come with any notions of, let's meet the people where they're at when we get there. They came with these ideas that were, there are people that are better than others that deserve to go. And now there's like some debate back and forth into how much Arthur Ruppin believed in these like racial differences. Mm-hmm. But he essentially started what became the kibbutz system by having these like training farms where Eastern European Jews would go kind of learn how to do things on the land, but he would determine which ones were of the highest quality to be able to go there, because he believed that Eastern European Jews had a greater intellect and therefore a better chance of succeeding in the colonial project of Israel. And those are like practically his words, because he saw it as, we're colonizing this area. Yeah. And those are, you can say like, okay, well, those are the words of his time, or those are the words of like, I don't know, academia, but also this is what these words mean. This is what
Yeah.
this means. Yeah, I mean, we could go deeper with him. There's
yeah.
so much.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I want to get into like the colonialism of it all and the colonial ideology. I think people forget that colonization is not just about land, but it's also about ideology, right? You don't just colonize land, you colonize the mind. You colonize socialization, right? You colonize the way that we talk to, like everything, right? Is colonization. But I'm like, what was I thinking? I don't know what I was thinking.
I took us on a little bit of a tangent.
No. And I was gonna bring us back, but I'm like, how did I get there? I'm like, where are we trying to land here? I think, so the conversation around Jewish indigeneity to the Middle East. I think that's a really interesting one because again, talking about binaries, right? Like, because I've heard people say things like, well, kind of like there's this assumption that if you're pro-Palestine and you're calling, Israel a colonial empire, then you're denying that, Jewish indigeneity. And I think what we're trying to say here is like, okay, yes, Jews are indigenous to Israel or to the Middle East, right? Just
How about, and listen, I don't know. Judaism is indigenous to the Middle East and Israel. Some Jews, like there's Baghdadi Jews, there's Jews, Yemeni Jews, there's some Jews that have stayed there for centuries, right? So Judaism is indigenous to the Middle East. There are groups of Jews that are indigenous to the Middle East. Are people, and this is where it gets really messy, are people whose ancestors lived in Eastern Europe for centuries indigenous to the Middle East?
So that's a fair question and a messy question. And I think it's okay. I think we need to but also, even let's say for argument's sake, they can somehow trace them back, okay, so for centuries, they were in Europe, but centuries before that, they were, in the Middle East. Let's just say for argument's sake that all of that is true. But the nation state of Israel, as it sits today, was established on colonial ideologies, right?
Yes.
So even if Judaism, all of that is indigenous to the land, Israel as a nation state is not.
Yeah.
Does that make, like, we can say, and I think that there was a post one time a while ago where it talked about like the three Israels or something. And it talked about like Israel as a modern nation state, Israel as this like biblical, thing, right? And then I think there was like another one or maybe a couple other like versions of what Israel is. And I think and maybe Israel as a nation, the leaders of Israel kind of purposely conflate all of these, right? To say like, hey, Jews are indigenous, therefore Israel, deserves, should exist, right? Like this idea of like, oh, it doesn't have a right to exist.
And
it's
that conflation. No. And
yeah.
It's that conflation that does in a way create more of the ability to be anti-Semitic, because that's why I always go, it's the nation state of Israel. Because yes, biblically, the nation of Israel, how it's spoken about in the Bible, is not the nation state of Israel. People who combine those two make it incredibly difficult for anyone to critique the nation state of Israel.
Yeah.
Because if we say Israel is a nation,
Nation states are not an indigenous concept.
No, they are
anywhere in the world.
Nowhere.
No
nation state,
the US,
no man-made borders were indigenous to anything.
Yes, like that's what I think gets really tricky for people is like, well, the US, I'm like, yeah, we're here trying to say the US is fucked up too, right? Like the US as a nation state, I'm not down with that either.
No,
I'm not down
that's
with Mexico as a nation state, right? Like
exactly.
Just because I am Mexican and the product of colonization doesn't mean I'm romanticizing anything really, right? And I think that's the other thing I want to mention is like this notion of like these experiences that Jewish students are experiencing on college campuses. I'm like, yes, that's fucked up. Like that's not okay. And I think we've been very clear, like we might need to call our own homies out, right? Like our own activist homies out on that shit. Like we are here to say we're not down with the binary. We're not down with like just because you're Jewish, you're whatever. And we're willing to sort of call that out within social justice circles. And I think that what is also hard for me is when people say like, look at all this experiences that Jewish people are having, look at how unsafe they are on college campuses. And I'm like, Black students feel the same fucking way. Immigrant students feel the same fucking way, right? Like, so, and I'm not trying to play Oppression Olympics. We're not trying to do that.
Right.
For me, it's more of like, I know. I imagine Jewish students experience this fucked upness. So can we come together?
Yes. Where is the meeting place of I know that this is bad because I have experienced it in this area. Like
Yes.
I know. So where can we come together instead of doing the Oppression Olympics of like, can you believe this is happening? Because yes, we can believe this is happening because that is how this country was made. Like the exact same way that
and we're fighting the same machine. I think that's what is so hard for me. Is like, and again, we're not going to speak for any other activists. We're not going to speak for anybody else in social justice circles again, because I think we will say this in the days. We are kind of here to call out our own people and say, like, we need to be really careful in any kind of anti-Semitism that we are perpetuating. And at the same time, that doesn't mean it's kind of like we're not living in that binary of like, well, if you're not with us, you're against us, right? Like we need to call out anti-Semitism within our own circles. And at the same time, like recognize that anti-Semitism is a product of the same machine that hurts us too. So me personally, I'm against all fucking forms of oppression, right? Like I'm out here trying to fight for true collective liberation where, we are not, so I think to assume then just all Free Palestine circles are inherently anti-Semitic without looking within those spaces and being like, just because those people are saying it doesn't mean the entire movement is inherently anti-Semitic. That's the hard part for me.
That's the really hard part. And like to just kind of bring it back quickly to the DEI circles, all DEI initiatives should be against obliterating or combating or challenging all oppression. So it should absolutely be included with the caveat of understanding the construct of whiteness and understanding that all of the oppressive systems live under the umbrella of white supremacy. Period. Like, that is number one. And that does include Jewishness, but also breaking that down and going, okay, how does white supremacy infuse some things within Jewishness? How does white supremacy infuse things within like Latin American communities? Like all of those things, right? Which is why DEI work is actually really, really difficult. And like surface level attempts to be like, well, now I have, I just took a class on like soul food. Like that's not, those are not like, if you really want to get into like the nitty gritty DEI, initiatives,
Mhm.
it's going to be hard, it's going to be messy, and it's going to be incredibly uncomfortable. Otherwise, you're
Yeah.
not really doing it right.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and even challenging too, like to kind of go back to your point about challenging social justice circles, challenging academia too, because
Hmm.
I do think she made some fair points about having some professors ask Israeli students to leave
Yeah, that was real. I was like, oh God. And
because they were uncomfortable.
I mean, as a professor, there's been students who've made me uncomfortable. I don't mean Israel, I mean white students or
Yeah.
men, right? Like, but yeah, I've never had the audacity to be like, you make me uncomfortable. I mean, I sometimes I joke and say like I will weed people out because I'll go in day one and say like we're gonna name all the elephants in the room. We're gonna talk about toxic masculinity. We're gonna talk about whiteness. We're gonna talk about white privilege. And so sometimes people like
I don't want
they
to.
themselves feel uncomfortable and I'm
Yeah.
like, I can't do this, right? So yeah, I agree. I do think like I'm like, what the fuck is happening when they're doing that, right? When they're saying, oh, your Israeliness is making me uncomfortable.
Or
I don't
making other
know.
students uncomfortable it was. And I think that does a disservice, right? Because the whole thing about it is the conversation. We're never going to get
Yeah,
to anywhere unless we're able to just have the really, really uncomfortable conversation
yeah,
um, that, you know, you and I are trying to have. But
yeah. I mean,
I don't know.
I want to say a last thing because I think I can't remember because I was when I was reading it, I was like, God, was it in this article or was it in something else that I read about the Women's March, the 2017 Women's March, and there was a woman who um, felt like some of the organizers were perpetuating anti-Semitism, and then I think she kind of brought it up to the organizers, and they essentially kind of like pushed her out because they weren't willing. I think one of the organizers was they were talking about what is his name? Is it Farrakhan or I don't know.
Oh,
Some
yeah.
of these like black nationalists, let's call them,
Yeah.
who have perpetuated very anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the organizers of the Women's March, I think it was Tamika Mallory, who kind of I don't know. There was this moment where this Jewish woman who was one of the like main organizers of the march sort of called it out and they kind of essentially pushed her out of the whole situation. And again, that was which I was like, fuck, that's fucked up and like that needs to be discussed. But then it was sort of used to say, well, clearly all these efforts are infused with anti-Semitism. And I'm like, whoa, like I think we need to have the conversation and I think that's a fair call out, but to then just generalize the entire effort as I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's where
No, yeah.
that's where
And
it
I
gets real
think
messy.
that it definitely is where it gets messy. And what I've seen a lot on social media recently, like in the uptick of like what I do refer to as latent anti-Semitism, is people quoting folks like Farrakhan or other Black Panther leaders, other social justice,
Who are also
like
misogynists, right? Like
who are
let's
absolutely misogynist. Um, Quoting all these leaders and these like very because people have been talking about Palestine for a very long time in
right.
social justice circles. So you have videos from the 1970s of all of these
Mm.
civil rights
Was it
leaders.
like Carmichael and
Yeah,
right? Like all
Kwame,
these
all of these guys, right?
yeah.
Who all had very, very poignant things to say about what was happening. But the people that are sharing them, to me, share very limited clips
Mm,
that then leave it so easily open to interpretation
yeah.
to go into well, then all Jews are genocidal
Mhm.
maniacs.
Mhm.
And that's the part where I'm like, oh, because then what it does is what you just said. It brings back the cycle of now we have to go, oh, well, now these social justice circles are anti-Semitic
Yeah.
because people aren't being careful with what they're sharing.
And I think that's ultimately what we want, right? Is we want to, I mean, because even things like when I learned kind of what blood libel was, and then I was seeing people posting things, I was like, ooh. And I remember sending them to you and being like, so is this in the realm of anti-Semitism? And you were like, yes.
Yes.
And I think,
Well, it's the no context, especially.
or the no context and the no fact checking, because
Yeah.
when I would see people posting things and I was like, and I'd go fact check it, I was like, oh shit. Like it was so easily fact checked, and of course people want to debate about that. Like, what is fact checking? Well, the things that you're looking up are inherently like, yes, we can go around in circles. But then if it's that debatable, then maybe we shouldn't be posting it
Yeah.
because it does perpetuate anti-Semitism. Because I think something that we kept coming back to, even around like somebody like Michael Rappaport, right? When everybody was posting that video of him saying that he was being paid to post, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
blah. And it clearly said AI number one. And I was like, this is so fucking ridiculous. Like, there's no way he's going to be in the hallway, allowing it. Like, it was just so
Yeah.
ridiculous. And people were posting it without context. And
And
then
people
like
were
saying
like
like,
with the comments of like, I knew it.
yeah,
And like, of course he did. Like, gotcha. And listen, I never want to go on the record defending Michael Rappaport, but that was anti-Semitic because it was playing into these conspiracy theories of, look, he's doing things for the money. Here's this Jew selling out. And what people don't realize in these social justice circles is that then, whether you want to or not, sits in your head as like, yeah, that's right. Jews do things for profit. And
amen.
Jews are going to be out here doing the stuff, the
Yeah.
shady shit,
And we
because they
don't
want to make
need
money.
to, I think something that you and I said, very clearly about like, we don't need to, I forgot, we were like, yeah, we know fucking he's crazy. Like, we don't need this video
No, we
to
don't need a video to
prove
show us he's a creep.
we can clearly know that he is just,
He shows up in the world exactly how he is.
he is who he is. We don't need this video to prove that. And in fact, it does then just sort of perpetuate these already existing ideas of anti-Semitism, right? It's not like, okay, it creates anti-Semitism in and of itself, but it, like you said, it sort of perpetuates those already existing notions that of conspiracy theories. And so I think, yeah, I was like, we don't have to keep demonizing even Israel, like the whole Israel harvesting organs or
Yeah.
skin bank
Which
thing,
she
like,
included in here as like linked to the blood libel. Because but that's where, to your earlier point, I think it was you said it. Did I say it? I don't know.
yeah.
People do not know what anti-Semitism is.
Mhm.
And so people who posted that were probably like really shocked that Israel is harvesting organs, not linking it to, oh, I'm inadvertently perpetuating something that has existed for centuries that's just
Mhm.
going to reinforce the anti-Semitism that I claim I'm not doing because I'm
Mhm.
not blaming Jews, I'm blaming Israel. But guess what? There's a lot of bigots out there that are like, that's proof.
Mhm.
That's proof. And
And I
now,
also think it gives a very like convoluted. Look, I'm not here to say. On one hand, I'm not here to say whether or not that's actually happening or not, right? Like in far as my fact checking, there's a lot of debate around what's actually happening. But on the other hand, like the idea, the way they sort of frame it, I think a lot of countries do organ harvesting. Like even calling it organ harvesting is very interesting considering like we on our driver's license can decide to be an organ donor. Okay, so what do they do with those organs if somebody's not immediately using it? They're going to harvest it, right? Or what is it called when they pull it out of your body? Like, I think framing it as like is real. Oh, look at how crazy they are. They're keeping a skin bank. I think a lot of I think a lot of countries,
a lot of like Western countries, I do think do this. I think if
right.
you're like medically, quote unquote, advanced at a certain level, you keep these things.
Yeah.
Not to say that it's like in defense, and same with you. Like I haven't seen anything definitive either way.
Yeah.
But the way that it was
framed
and posted was so very like they could have just as easily said Israel is defiling bodies. Like that was like the thing. It was like they're consuming them. Like,
right.
You know?
Yeah. And again, I think there can be a conversation around there's a conversation to be had around, okay, what is happening with the bodies of, Palestinians who have died, and, the sort of sanctity of death in those things. But I think, again, the way that it's framed is not speaking to that, right? It's not, it is sort of buying into this other thing.
And to Dara Horn's point, it is seemingly targeted to make Jews look evil. Right? Like her thing about anti-Semitism is like what I said, which kind of I'm like I'm with her and I'm not, because she didn't to me back it up in the way that like I needed it to be backed up.
Yeah.
But these like moments of Michael Rappaport or these posts on the organ harvesting is continuing a centuries-long trend of making Jews look evil or immoral or terrible, which is not the reason necessarily why the nation state of Israel and its government is doing the things that they're doing.
So right? I think that's I mean, I think maybe we should end there so that we can maybe come back in our next episode to unpack that. But we'll just kind of say that I think we need to really do a better job of differentiating between Jewishness and the nation state of Israel. And of course, we know that the nation state of Israel likes that conflation because it works in their favor, because then they can weaponize that and defend themselves and blah, 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 blah.
They can hide behind it so easily.
They get to hide behind it. But I think that that's where, those of us who are trying to fight for liberation need to make a much more concerted effort to differentiate that and to say at the same time, like, because I think the messiness of the way Israel weaponizes anti-Semitism to defend its atrocities, right? Like that's fair to say, right? Like, and I think that because it's to say, if Israel is a Jewish nation, right? Because that's what it purports to be, right? Then to say that Israel is genociding right, a whole people is to like this idea that because Jewish people are oppressed, there's no way that they can become the oppressors, right? And we're not trying to say that because of they're Jewish that they're becoming the oppressors, but through the nation state of Israel, weaponizing
the system of creating a nation state.
Right, and weaponizing that very oppression, then use it to oppress other people, right? Like this is where it gets this weird, like convoluted thing. And so it's like, like just like, I mean, again, it's the same way.
Sorry, but
No,
I feel like that's kind of what she was trying to get at, is like we all as oppressed people should be champions for Israel, because like Israel made it. Oppressed people got a land, created a nation state. We should all be about protecting that at all costs.
Yeah.
Without seeing, but wait a minute.
How did they get there?
You use the system that is currently preventing me as an oppressed person over here
Yeah.
from achieving my liberation.
Yeah. And at what
Right.
cost does that come, right? Because if your freedom, safety, all of those things come at the cost of somebody else's freedom and safety, then it's not actually freedom and safety. It's
Yeah.
just white supremacy in another form.
It's
It's just
it's
colonialism,
just,
right?
it's just
Like,
colonialism.
and so I think what you and I are always trying to come to the conclusion of being like, yes, anti-Semitism exists. Yes, it fucking and exists here, here, and here. We need to call it out. We need to talk about it. And ultimately, we're all trying to get to the same place, right? We're all fighting the same machine.
Yeah.
But I think it's, yeah. I'm like, we'll land there because we can
there.
go on and on.
And yes, anti-Semitism should be part of your conversation if you want collective liberation.
That's it.
That's it.
All right.
Oh.
See you next time.
Yeah, bye.